Hello, Education 200, Education 585. It's Dr. Allen. Hope you are having a great week. A few things before we get going today. One, thank you all very much for your patience. I've been trying to get the grading out this week. I am a little behind. I'm recording this on September 15th. I had a little small window this week to get recording done for next week because this, and you all will experience this in the not too distant future. But this week is the first week of student-teacher observations, and I have some students out in the field, and I had to get out to get them. So I'm trying to play a little bit of catch up. I have one to do tomorrow. So again, my problem, my job. But just to give you the heads up, I'm going to make sure I bust, and try to get everything done and graded. A few other things. I'm just going to share my screen here, if you don't mind. Don't need to worry about that just yet. Don't even need to worry about that at all. Let me pull up our class. There it is. This week, we're going to look at modern policies. We're going to look at the reading is due. Public schools have grounds to punish students for their off-campus online speech. I'm going to come back to that topic actually here in about a minute. And again, more of the history of public education. The topics for this week, though, I will say there's going to be a little bit of repetition. I kind of tried to sneak some in last week, so I won't be talking as long. Also, I was just going to say a few things. One, thank you all very much for hanging in there with your hours. Everyone's been getting their hours in. Let me rephrase that. Everyone's been getting approval for locations that they can do their hours. If there was any questions, I appreciate that. Just as a reminder, please note, you only have to do 10 for this class, and you don't have to do them immediately. You have until your service learning log is due, which is not due until December 5th. So you just need to get 10 hours in before then. You don't have to, once you get your placement, you don't have to go and do like 10 hours all at once. You could do that. Make sure you get your field log signed by someone at wherever you are. But hours verified, but you can spread those out however works best for you. So if you just want to do an hour a week somewhere, I think you could probably still do that. It's not due until after Thanksgiving, and you do have to do a reflection paper. And there's the guidelines if you need them, but they're just basically answering basic questions. And I'll retouch on that once we get a little closer to midterm, kind of put that back on the forefront of everything. But again, you don't have to do your hours all at once. You have until December 5th, basically, to get them in. But everyone's been doing great. I mean, most people are doing tutoring, Boys and Girls Club. I can't argue with that. Sorry, I look at myself on the camera and not on the screen and not on the camera. I still catch myself doing it. But that's it. You just need to do your service learning essay after you do your hours. The other thing, if you were in 581 only, not 200, there is the research paper, and I'm actually going to make sure that everything is posted up there. I thought I had posted it up, but if I didn't, I will make sure it is up this week, and I'll send out an email, and I'll get into a little more details on what everything is due there. Let me make sure that I did it for you all. It's been a long week. I have not. I'll make sure that's up. I'm a little behind on the gradings of the philosophy statements and on. Like I say, I promise to make sure to get those all in. Are done ASAP. A couple things also. I'm just going to stick here and kind of go for it because I think I posted it both. Did not. I did not put it in here. Silly me. I'll show it to you. I think I emailed it, and I think I posted it here. There it is, the flyer. This week, September 23rd. KDP, if you don't know what KDP is, that is the Education Honor Society here at Shepherd. They do awesome stuff. They have been working with me as far as trying to put together a panel of students who have kind of went through our program. They're kind of towards the end, and it's basically a Q&A session. I would strongly recommend going to this. It is, I'm going to open the flyer up right now. And there it is. Apparently I opened it up earlier. It's called the Know-It-All Panel. It'll be very, very, very useful. If you don't know what praxis is, go to that. They'll probably put it in terms that make far better sense than anything I can spit out on these videos. Don't know what juncture is, they'll tell you. Anything else you need to ask or want to ask, they'll be able to do it. We have students from every discipline that's going to be there. So if you're secondary ed, secondary English, secondary social studies, physical education, art, social studies, whatever, if you're elementary, there'll be someone there. We have someone from each program that is going to be there to help out, answer questions. I'm going to be there. I think some of our other professors will be there. I would strongly suggest showing up. And just to kind of encourage you to show up, I am willing to do this. I think I put on there I would give extra credit, and I am willing to do that. But if maybe this will help a little more. If you look, this week we have the normal Edpuzzle Flipgrid discussion. If you attend the session, verify that you attend the session. I don't care if it's a selfie in the auditorium and you email it to me. I don't care if you walk up to me. I'll try to make sure I have a pen and paper to make sure I write everyone's name down. Some sort of verification. Can you stay? Not like check in, check out. You stay, you participate, and things like that. I'm willing to just waive discussion 4 for you for this week. I think what you can pick up in that session is very, very important. So if that is something to get you there, to not have to do a Flipgrid for this week, please, that's fine. That's a small price to pay for me. I think that a lot of the things there will help you in the future. Edpuzzle will still be up, but if you still want to do the discussion board and the Edpuzzle and do the extra credit, I'll give you 10 points. That's fine. But if you just want to just skip this week's Flipgrid, that also works. And also, with that being said, I'll probably at the end be talking about CESA. Everyone that is in education is a member of CESA. If you are in, once you declare education as your major, whether you've passed juncture, whether you passed praxis, whatever, you're a member of CESA. It's our student body, or Shepherd Education Student Association. We're trying to get it going back up and running again. I mentioned that I think last week. I have a couple ideas and a couple suggestions. A lot of it might be like working with Shepherd Treat if you're interested in working. If you're going to enter education, obviously you're going to be interested in working with students and children. That will be a good opportunity to do something. It's an opportunity to just get to know some people. I'm going to point to it that way. I've got something planned where I think we're going to try to get like a task force together through CESA to kind of come up with some rules, rules and guidance with our collaborative room. I don't know if anyone's noticed, we have a lot of new tech in there, a lot of new tech. And it's been kind of rogue in there. Not that people have been using it, that's not the issue, just who's been in there, who hasn't, lights not on, food, gum, things like that. So we kind of want to get things situated and maybe have some people who are willing to sit in there while they're waiting on other classes or sign some equipment out. We'll talk about that on Thursday, or just in general, if you're interested. But enough about all that. Why don't we just go ahead and go? But I'm going to throw this up here just one more time. Very important. Thursday, 6 p.m. Bird Center. Oh, I should say the Bird Center. If you do not know where the Bird Center is, I'm pointing this way to the library. I don't know if that's my hand. I'm pointing this way. I'm pointing right towards the science hall. I'm like looking at it through my window. If you go to the library, there's a building that has a rotunda that's right beside it. That's actually connected to the library. That's the Bird Center. And you are welcome to go in there, and you are welcome to go to the auditorium and at 6 o'clock be in there for our meeting and our panel. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I think it's supposed to run about an hour. I think that's the plan. So with all that being said, that should do that. And here's what we're going to do. Let me scoot this down. And what did I do with that? Whoops, there it is. A lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try to be on my A game and stay on topic and keep rolling through this. I talked about a lot of this last week, but I still feel like I want to just go over a few nuts and bolts that are mentioned in the Taking Sides books and videos and things like that. You will definitely see me jump slides today. I'm just going to kind of highlight what I think is really important and stuff that I think would be of interest to everyone. Right off the bat, you're going to see me move, but through some names, because we're going to come back to them later in class. This is a PowerPoint that when we're meeting face to face, I like to use. It's basically the modern period of education and some of the influences. We're going to do a whole day, or I'm going to do a lecture on him, but I would not be doing any justice if I don't at least already mention the name John Dewey. You've probably already seen him in readings. I know he's been mentioned in a couple already. May have heard it in other classes. He is usually seen as the, I guess, the godfather, the founding father of modern education for a whole bunch of reasons. But I'm just going to go ahead and throw him out there. He's part of the progressive movement, mostly associated with the early 20th century. And he kind of where Horace Mann is seen as the father of modern public schools, and probably the first person to kind of get public schools and education going in the United States, I guess, in a modern sense. Dewey is the guy who took it to the next level. I kind of think about him, maybe it's my social studies mind. It's kind of like a George Washington, Horace Mann, John Dewey, Abraham Lincoln type thing, two pillars, two men who did great things in a field, and so to speak, and move things forward. So John Dewey, that's all I'm going to say on him today, because like I say, I have a whole day that I'm going to talk about him. Not a day, just a whole lecture. Day might be a lot of Dewey. Also, I just wanted to make note, this is another 20th century thing, but I think we take it for granted. Public schooling is something that is still, well, let me rephrase that. Secondary public schooling is still something that's not, I'll go ahead and say it, fairly new in this country. It's not something that's been around forever and ever. My grandmother actually was part of it in West Virginia when you only had to go till 8th grade, I believe. But a lot of states started to change that in the early 20th century. Kalamazoo is a very famous case where they started to pave the way for secondary funding and levies and things like that. You'll hear about levies on bills today in Berkeley and Jefferson County about building schools and such. Kalamazoo did that in the early 20th century to get their secondary education program going. And when I mean secondary education, we're talking what we would consider modern high school. There was a lot of debates about what the curriculum should be, even when they were establishing high schools. Should they be more work preparation? And when I mean work, think about the workforce that was going on in the early 20th century, more agricultural training, things like that. Or should it be more of a college prep? Or, as it says there, the development of the purpose of high school should be classical studies. Should high school just be for those looking to go to college and maybe strengthening their skills? There was a lot of debate about that. I think we still have those debates today about really what our school should be. Should we stress just strictly college-based stuff? Should we stress more job skills? And when I mean job skills, I mean these are still credible fields and require a high level of intelligence. So should we stress those fields as opposed to just strictly a college track type approach? It's different in different places, but it's a battle we've been having. I hate to say it, battle. It's been a debate that's been had for a long, long time, probably almost 100 years now. I'm getting close to it. I'm not going to really get into the Committee of 10. It sounds very French Revolutionary. But again, they kind of have that same battle where they're talking about what should be taught. Should it be classical studies? Should it be a college-based approach? Should the curriculum be very demanding? Should it just be more life-based type things? What is the purpose of high school? And that was what was going on in the early 20th century, or secondary education. Some people, if you go to Europe, they do things such as tracking and stuff in some kind of states. We're going to talk about a little bit about international education. And a lot of times middle school's a big time for students in those schools, because you kind of get put, they call it tracking, you kind of get put on a path as to what your career is going to be. The theory is, though, when you get done, you're going to be very strong in your field. So that's kind of a different approach than what we have here. I think a lot of people sometimes don't figure out what they want to do or what they think they should do with their schooling until sometimes college, after college. Some will do a degree and then finish up. You know what? I'll use myself as an example. I was a history major. I thought about teaching, never really jumped into it. Then my senior year, I decided to go do my graduate. I applied for graduate schools in education. So that would have been 22, 23 years old. So there you go. Where things really start to change, that's pre-World War II stuff. When World War II happens, big event, and comes back, it's almost like you can divide the 20th century in all aspects, pre and post war or World War II. There's a lot of things between a debate between equity and excellence. We talked a little bit last week about the civil rights movement and the Little Rock Nine and Brown versus Board of Education, Plessy versus Ferguson. Those are things, that we're starting to be debated and in some ways encouraged. There's also a more progressive movement that's starting to take root in education. Dewey is considered a progressive, and a lot of times when those ideas are rooted, it takes 20 to 30 years for them to really take root. By the way, I think I messed up the recording on this earlier, but I did want to make this point. I'm re-reporting. If you're in education long enough, you'll hear some old guards. Like I worked with people that have been teaching for 20, 30, in some cases 40 years. And they'll say, there's no new ideas anymore because they just felt like ideas just got recycled. Like you get away from it, and then like 10, 20 years, they'd come back. So what might be progressive one year might be seen as traditional the next, and then it becomes progressive again later. But we'll talk about the progressive movement. And there are things about that are different than just traditional stand and deliver approaches. Major post-World War II event that I mentioned already last week, but I might have flown through it. I was just going down that list, so I want to rehash a few things. With Sputnik, and I think I mentioned this, but when the Soviets launched that caused a big reaction for science and technology and mathematical educations in our secondary schools and elementary schools, making sure that our students were strong in these fields because there was a fear. It was a Cold War result. We didn't want to lose track to the Soviets, so to speak. At least that was the fear. Also, a couple things you can't overlook. Public schools in probably in the 1950s, but started to grow exponentially in terms of population because more people were staying through high school because of laws changes and things like that. And also in 1946, 47, early 50s, there was a baby boom. And you figure if a soldier comes back, I'm not going to get into biology, but if a child is born in 47, that child's going to be in school. There was not really a whole lot of pre-K, so you figure not a lot of places even had K at that point. But if you figure 5, 6 years old, 51, 52, 53, schools are going to start getting more and more students. It's a big thing. My mom, she's a baby boomer. I'm sure a lot of your grandparents are probably baby boomers. We talked about McCullum Board of Education, but just to add a few things to that also, we talked about you cannot be released from during the day for religious education in public school classrooms. That was the one we got into last week where it debated the issue of religion in classrooms and whether you could leave to go do something or not. And also Brown versus Board of Education Topeka. There's no such thing as separate but equal. That was established in Plessy versus Ferguson. Those we mentioned last week. So this one deals with religion. This one deals with there's no such thing as separate but equal. And Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, established that schools could be segregated as long as they were equal, which there's really no such thing, or there was no such thing. So anyway, Little Rock Nine, you watched the video on them, so I'm not going to get too bogged down talking about that. Very important event, though. I think it showed a lot of the hardline resistance to ending segregation. Obviously, terrible. And when we look back on it, it's something that we, hopefully everyone frowns upon and just says that can't believe that happened. But Little Rock Nine. 1959, maybe some of you are familiar with this. The first ACT test was actually given. That would have been, I think most of us that are either watching this video or delivering this video are familiar with taking the ACT. Vygotsky is another person we're going to talk about a little later in the class, so I'm not going to get bogged down with him. I'll probably come back to this video, but he establishes thought and language. It was a big, the main thing you're going to get out of Vygotsky, and if you don't take anything, I'll go ahead and say it, is the zone of proximal development. It's going to be something along the lines of like when we talk about Piaget, which you'll get some of this a little more in 320 than you will in 200, but it's still good to know that he came up with this concept. And don't worry about Vygotsky right now. We'll get into him later. I talked a little bit about the civil rights movement last week. So just to kind of rehash, make sure that you're familiar with that, it's mostly a late 50s, mid 60s movement in terms of the schooling and changing things. 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act emphasized the education of disadvantaged children. This is, I believe, part of the Great Society of Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ. It was called a new progressivism. A lot of the Great Society programs they were trying to recreate some of the aspects of the New Deal from the 1930s. And of course, a lot of the thinking stuff that happened with the New Deal was actually being done, especially in education in the 10s and the 20s. 1970s, an emphasis on individualism and relevance. So, it's there. The 60s, I think you're probably going to pick up. And if you're in secondary, a lot of times there was a lot of changes in curriculum in the 60s. The 60s is a big change. Different leaderships, the World War II generation, some are coming out, and there's a lot of, we know about the 60s, there's a lot of cultural battles that are taking place. But there's a lot of big events and needed things that do come out of the 60s. 1963, the Learning Disabilities Association of America is formed, to deal with students who are students and individuals that, make sure there's an equal playing field with people who might need accommodations. I think I mentioned this last week, but just in case, 1963, first bilingual and bicultural public schools established in Miami. I think you can see some Cold War aspects to that in terms of, what was going on in Cuba and things like that. Huge Cuban population down in Miami. My sister actually lives down there. 1964 Civil Rights Act. I believe I did mention last week, but just in case, again, getting into the equality type aspects. Another philosopher that we're going to talk about a little later is Bruner, towards a theory of education. There is a YouTube. By the way, I will have this PowerPoint posted if you want to check stuff out ahead of time. Bilingual Education Act, 1968. It's there. First magnet schools actually established in 1968 too. We don't have, I don't even know if we have any in West Virginia now that I think about it. I do know Washington County, Maryland has some too. It's schools that focus on different things. Like there might be one that's more science and math based. Maybe there's one that's a humanities based school and the curriculum's kind of rooted in some of that. Or they might have a group of students that kind of go through that aspect. I put this in here only because some of you are probably familiar with this. Cole's Open Classroom promotes open education. That was in 1969. If you go around, if you're from Berkeley County or have been in any of the schools in Berkeley County or actually Washington County, because I've been in a few, some of the older schools had open classrooms. Literally, they were just open and all the instruction was kind of going on in open spaces, no matter what grade you were in. One of the first things people started to do was build walls. And what I mean by that, chalkboards, tow trays. I don't know if anyone knows what a tow tray is, but the things they would put up filing cabinets and start to make their own personal space. I don't know if the open classroom thing ever was a success. At least it wasn't locally. And actually, if you go to some of the schools around here, you'll see where they built up the walls. I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe Boonesboro High School, I'm pointing towards Boonesboro, used to be an open concept type school, and I believe they built the walls. I thought their assistant principal or a teacher over there told me that when I was on observation. I do know Boonesboro Middle School still has aspects of that because you can still see the low walls, and I think it was an open concept. But again, it was something they tried, and it just didn't take root. But different thoughts. Some work, some don't. 1970. This is more secondary, or I'm sorry, post-secondary, but the Kent State shootings takes place. Again, it shows the volatility of what's going on in the 60s and 70s as far as traditional versus counterculture type movements. Piaget publishes The Science of Education, 1970. Another philosopher that we're going to try to come back to, but you'll hear him a lot, is Piaget. Dewey, Bruner, Vygotsky, Piaget, they're people that, you probably won't make it through this degree without hearing their names at least a few times. I talked about Title IX last week. I felt like I butchered that a little bit. So I'm going to just kind of clearly state Title IX prohibits discrimination based on sex in all aspects of education. That's the definition. I felt like I mumbled through that last week. There was a few I mumbled through last week, I felt. So Title IX, it is there. Prohibits discrimination based on sex in all aspects of education. Malinkin versus Bradley, court ruling that Detroit suburbs were not required for busing. Court ruling that Detroit suburbs were not required for busing students into their schools for racial balance. This still kind of goes on in schools a lot, but they were trying to talk in the 70s, they were trying to get equal demographics within schools because they felt like that was for the betterment of everyone. And of course, I don't think, I'll tread softly on how I say this. There's always the fear that sometimes schools that are in inner cities might not be getting the same funding as schools out in the suburbs and things like that, or access to as many resources. It's not supposed to be that way, but sometimes it seems like it's that way. And this was an attempt. There was people who were trying to say, well, maybe we can get some of the students out and try to balance everything. It's still something you'll hear in the news sometimes today. Charter schools are another way that some people try to circumvent this and such. But 77, the Apple IIe is introduced, becomes very popular in schools. In the early 80s, I remember having, I don't know if it was a 2E, but I'm typing. The old green Macs that were in classrooms, they were revolutionary. Now they probably don't have as much power as this thing, my phone. Or I know they don't. So it's kind of funny, but at least I find it funny. Another thing just to kind of note, this is more secondary, so I'm not going to kind of get into it too much, but it does, I guess, the influx of teachers. The GI Bill provided, opportunity for a lot of servicemen once they finished World War II to get a higher education. And there was starting to become a lot of questioning about what was the role of education going to be for African Americans. Du Bois, WEB, and Booker T. Washington have this debate. It's a big civil rights debate. This is actually early on. Booker T. Washington, very famous for the Tuskegee Institute, and the proper pathway as far as African Americans go. Du Bois is definitely more, I don't know where progressive, I guess, is a way to do it, where he's more like sometimes you gotta, rattle a few cages type thing. And Booker T. Washington is more traditional kind of, we're going to do it this way. We're going to do it like there's a system that we need to establish and such. And I kind of mentioned this with the bus ruling, but, some people thought that the Brown versus Board of Education there were still ways to segregate, even if it was not legal to do it. And a lot of times that's socioeconomically than it is just, legally. So again, it's stuff that we've fought not only here, but everywhere for thousands of years. Not saying any of it's right. It's one of those things and we're still working on it. A couple things in the 80s and 90s. Just basically take out of this the nation at risk. I mentioned it last time, but it called for a new basics and not mediocrity. Don't focus as much on social problems was a movement. I think we've kind of, again, gone circling around and focus on just, the 3 R's. So it's a more conservative base type approach. And I guess that's one thing to take out of this. For the 60s and 70s, as you can see, maybe the open classrooms is a good example. It's a little more progressive. I'll throw it out there. It's probably seen as more liberal in the 60s and 70s. And the 80s and probably early 90s are seen as more conservative, which I think you can just look at the presidents and the leadership and kind of figure that out somewhat. It's not a perfect match, but it's there. Curriculum needed to be tightened. Standards needed to be a little more rigorous. Stuff like that's going on in the 80s. Few things. National board certifications established in 87. Because it's an online university. University of Phoenix is actually established in 89. I think it did a lot more distance learning then, but the beginnings of computer-based education are kind of getting going. I mentioned the IDEA last week, the Individuals with Disability Act that passed in 1990. And the first charter school, I think I mentioned last week, from Minnesota in 1991. 1993, Massachusetts Education Reform Act required Common Core and statewide testing. So all counties in Massachusetts were doing the same curriculum. We've talked about that with the flip grids and the taking sides, and it required statewide testing to measure against it. The idea again is that competition, maybe counties are based on who's doing what approaches are successful counties doing, the counties that are struggling a little bit. It was kind of to improve the education system there. I don't think it was quite like the national Common Core where it was tied to financial type things like grants and such. But 1999, this isn't a policy or anything, but I think it's the beginning of obviously a dark trend. The Columbine killings take place in Colorado. Of course, you can still see the influence of that today. Of course, in other shootings that have taken place in terms of the securities in our schools and how you check in. The last school that I was at spent tens of thousands of dollars to have an entrance where basically you were funneled into the office. Obviously, we had our keypads and you swiped and you couldn't go back to the part of the school. There was no way to do it. And a lot of that, it wasn't Columbine. I think that created that, but it was just an accumulation of a lot of the school shootings that had taken place. There's a lot of things that are still going on. I mentioned the progressivism is usually seen with more liberal type approaches. And I'm not even talking like what we would use liberal and conservative for today. I mean, as far as politics, and they may align up sometimes, a lot of times, but just liberal in terms of maybe trying new things where conservative would be more traditional based approaches in schools. It's, I think like I've mentioned, a lot of things just go in circles in terms of this. And a lot of times it is your leadership, but it's always good to try new things. And I think when we look at I always like the international thing a little bit because it gives us new ideas and maybe try some things in new ways. I'm going to throw this lady's name out there, Diane Ratzovich. Actually, I mentioned her in my Reykjavik, in my dissertation, 12 years ago now. But I'm going to throw the quote out there. The educational enterprise is the victim of its own successes, since new problems have arisen from the long sought solutions to earlier problems. Basically, there's always going to be problems. And our public school system is actually, in a lot of ways, a success. I mean, I know it's always critiqued and things like that, but everyone here has probably been through, K through 12 schooling, taken a lot of things out of it. There's things that aren't right with it, but I think that can be said with a lot of things. And everyone has an opinion on it, which can help, and sometimes it doesn't help. And also our schools are basically limited, but not total institutions, meaning that, they could do certain things in life, but they don't handle all things. They're not your parents. They're not your family. People do things outside of the schools. They don't, I'm going to say this, and in theory, you probably should be getting free thinking and not indoctrinated, which I don't think that goes on in school a lot, but some people will make arguments other ways, and you may have a different opinion on that. A couple things from the 2000s. No Child Left Behind. I believe I mentioned that last week. It was tied to high stakes testing of Bush administration, 2009 Common Core, the Obama administration. There were a lot of waivers that were put in for a lot of these, specifically No Child Left Behind. You can tell this PowerPoint's a little old. I need to update this. As of 2016, 5 states still did not require kindergarten. Alaska, Idaho, New York, Pennsylvania, and part of New Jersey. I guess it's certain counties. Someone told me though, when I did this, that Pennsylvania had changed some things. So I need to check that. But just to let you know, kindergarten is not always a requirement. It just seems like it is at this point. When I went to kindergarten, you were AM or PM, and I'm sure a lot of your parents might have been that way too, or your grandparents. I was an afternoon kindergarten person. Froebel, the Garden of Children. He's usually seen as the founder of kindergarten, Frederick Froebel. I'm going to sneeze, excuse me. Sorry. I guess that's a signal that I should be wrapping up. Froebel actually did the Garden of Children kindergarten, German. So it's just a fun fact. And I think I'm going to wrap it up there. That's just a quick rundown. I know that's me basically running down a list and just adding a little bit to it, but again, just to kind of keep it going, and hopefully everyone's still with me. I'm gonna wrap it up there. Don't forget the Thursday. I'm gonna pull it up one last time. Thursday. Know-it-all panel. You don't have to do your discussion. If you do that, we just need to verify that you were there and you stayed the whole time and listened to everything. Hopefully you can ask some questions. I really do think you'll get a lot out of it. So I'll send this file. I'll definitely send a reminder out. Again, thank you all for your patience. Everyone's been great. Every email anyone sends with questions, very courteous. I appreciate that. Sometimes technology doesn't work with Brightspace and such. Still feeling that out a little bit. So with all that being said, I'll stop babbling. Thank you all very much. I hope semester's going well. It's cruising by. What are we in? It's week 5, I think. I think this is the video for week 5. I'm looking at my calendar. It doesn't have it on there, but I was trying to count. I'll catch you all later. Have a great day. And if you have any questions, feel free to email anytime.